In this video, we're going to explore the 2D asset content creation pipeline. So a 2D asset in Unity is just a simple image. So you can create one of these using any number of image creation tools. I'm going to be using Photoshop, but depending on what type of image you're creating and why you're creating it will kind of depend on what tool you use. So Photoshop is obviously great for digital painting and creating something with sort of a painted aesthetic, or maybe out of photo reference or something. Illustrator would be another tool that you would use for something that's cleaner, more like a vector art style aesthetic. Or you might, if you are making textures specifically, you might use a program like Substance Designer or Painter or Quixel or something like that. So the type of program you use really depends on what you're trying to do. But the 2D content creation process all boils down to saving out a simple 2D image, and two file formats are the most kind of typical to be used for games. JPEGs are one of those, but are not kind of the preference. Instead, you will typically use something that's a lossless codec like PNG. So to kind of show you just the basics of this, I'm just going to go into Photoshop, create a new canvas at a pixel resolution of 1024 by 1024. Now there's a reason why I'm choosing these dimensions. These are what we call a power of 2. So in order to make your images both as optimized as possible, but also to create sort of low resolution versions, which the game engine does by default, you typically want to stick to a power of 2 in your image formats. So I don't know what the power of 2 is, but the common dimensions here are like 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, 2048 by 2048. And you can see that between these, they just double. So 512 times 2 is 1024. 1024 times 2 is 2048. You can not do a square format if you don't want to, but it's kind of better to do a square format and have some padding, some space that doesn't get used, than to shrink or crop your image or something like that. These aren't really like strict rules. It's not like your game will break if you have images that are different resolutions, but it's just sort of a best practice that's still around, and it has some various optimization reasons why. So that's my my pixel size. Now resolution I don't care about, because this is pixels per inch, and since we're never going to be like printing this out or anything physical, this could be set to absolutely anything. It's just how many pixels are set to be an inch. I'm going to choose, instead of well, you can choose different options for your background contents. And for some reason it's not letting me choose a transparent background, but we can set that up. So we can change all of this stuff down the road if we need to. So I'm just going to hit create. And here we have something. I'm just going to grab a paintbrush and scale it up a bit and just draw a simple smiley face, just so you can see what happens when we bring this into Unity. So, like I said, we want to save out our images as a specific file type, a format, and the two that get used most commonly are JPEG and PNG, and the preference is on PNG, not only because it is lossless, so it won't have compression artifacts, it also will give you a channel for alpha. So if you have parts of your image that are transparent, a PNG will let you do that, whereas a JPEG will not. It will turn it white or black or something like that. So PNG is the preference. People also use targas and TIFFs Target is common in the Unreal Engine, and TIFF is used when you need some data that's a little more robust, higher bit depth and things like that. So PNG is 90% of the time what you're going to use. So let's just call this example. So we're going to be changing this. You can choose which option. It does still allow you to use compression, which is nice. So this will save slowest, but it'll create the smallest size. I usually go for something in the middle until I'm kind of ready to create the final assets, and then I might compress them down. Okay, so let's go back to Unity, and let's create a new folder in the base of our assets called textures. And then we're going to create another one as well called sprites. And I'm going to explain the difference between texture and a sprite in a minute. Okay, so let's go into textures first, and then open up Windows directory, and where did it go? Desktop. Just drag this example PNG file in here. As you can see, this image came in. When you click on it, you have editing options. So here, most of these you don't need to change, but the reason why we created two folders, one called textures and one called sprites, is because certain 2D elements of your game are going to be, if you're working on a 3D game, applied to meshes, and those are called textures. Whereas certain elements, and this is true for things like user interface elements, so if you had like a HUD that had an icon of the character, image, or like a health bar, those would be built out of sprites. And you can change the type of image, the import file texture type, from default, which is what it is by default. If you've created your project with the 3D options, like we did way back at the beginning, if you created it with the 2D options, it's going to import new images as sprites. But at any point, you can change an imported image type from one to the other. So I was on default originally. I can change it to sprite and hit apply, and now this is going to behave like a sprite, which gives it certain other options or properties, and it also makes it compatible with Unity's user interface system. So that's just something to be aware of, that all your images will get boiled down to a PNG or a JPEG or some file type, but depending on your import settings here, they may only be able to be used on certain components if they are set to the correct texture type. So we're going to keep this one as default. We're going to look at normal maps shortly, and we're going to also look at sprites and UI elements at some point as well, either in this video or in the user interface video in a few videos. So these other ones you don't really need to worry about yet. Some of them get created by Unity. Some of them you just don't really use that much. Now, if your image comes in and you have texture on it, so transparency. Let me show you how this works. I'm just going to make this a layer so I can then erase a portion of it. So let's knock out this white area right here, and then go ahead and save it again. Now, this is actually a good point, because what we did was we saved it on the desktop, and this is the document that Photoshop is referencing. Whereas in Unity, we now have, if you right click and show this in Explorer, we now have a duplicate copy of it inside our assets. So we either can do one of two things. We can either copy and paste this over in Windows. We could drag another version in and create another copy of it. Or we could just double click on this, which means it's going to open in whatever our default editing program is for that image type. And that may or may not be useful. You can right click and change this if you want by going to properties. I have it set so that my PNG file types open by default in Photoshop. And if you save this and apply it, then what that means is you can just double click this now and it's going to open up in Photoshop. So this is the version that's saved to the desktop. This is the version that's saved to assets, and obviously those are different now. So I'm just going to do that same thing again. I did remove some of this border around here, and then save. Oops, a bit more there. Save. And now this will be updated when we go back into Unity. And right now, it's not using transparency. Sometimes when you import an image in for the first time that has transparency, this usually gets set up correctly. But if it's not working, you can click this little toggle right here, and then you can see the transparency around the image. So that was just kind of for demonstration purposes. Textures don't typically have transparency, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So for a texture, that's you can leave it toggled on or off. Okay, so how do textures work? Well, textures are applied to materials, and then materials are applied to models. So here we have our tank, and if we click on the mesh, which is on this tank game object, we have this Lambert 1 material, which is currently embedded inside of our mesh. So we kind of need to do what we did before and extract our materials, or we can just create a material from scratch and assign it. So actually, let's do that so I can show you how that works. So inside my materials, I'm going to right click in here and do create material. And I'm just going to call this tank base underscore M for material, just to keep things kind of organized. And now I can drag and drop this onto the tank. And you can see here now the color has changed. It's turned white, but also it has properties associated with this material that I can adjust. So my metallic here is going to make something look more like metal the more it's increased, and the smoothness is going to change how it responds to light. So something that's very rough or has a low smoothness will not reflect things as well, whereas something that's super reflective, you'll be able to see more of the environment. This little thumbnail here shows you a little more accurate that difference. So the way this gets used in most texturing pipelines is not by just setting these values by hand. Sometimes it's the case that you can do that, but most of the time you are going to use texture maps for your color, which is the albedo channel here, which controls the sort of base color, for the metallic, for the smoothness, for the normal map, and then occlusion, or any of the other maps you want. You add textures and apply those to the material. And you can see there are these little square spots next to each of these. This indicates that you can drag and drop a texture into one of these. So what we could do is, in our textures, take our example and drag and drop it in to any of these channels. So if I put it in albedo, now that texture is going to be applied to our mesh. In the thumbnail here, you can kind of see it a bit better, that it's mapping it onto this cube. But if you look in the game, it looks not really like a smiley face. It looks more like, I don't know, some like black and white cow or something like that, I guess. And that is because this texture, I've basically just drawn onto an image, and this model has a very specific map, a UV map, for how the texture is applied to the mesh itself. And when we were building this, I was talking to you about how you can UV map as you go and align things as you're building them. And when I did the final export of that, I didn't really pay attention to the UV map. So let's go back into that 3D model and see where my UV elements are. And then I'm going to show you how you can extract that UV map and bring that into Photoshop and use that as a reference for when you create your texture. Okay, so here we are in Maya. Let's go recent files and open the player file. And here's our tank. And our tank actually includes some other submeshes now, so we can adjust those. But if we just click on the yeah, it's selecting all of them because we just parented them one after the other. So let me go through and like fix this layout. We may need to do a little bit more unwrapping to make sense of what we've got going here. So first of all, the barrel right here doesn't have any sort of it doesn't correspond to this shape at all, and we could remap this if we wanted, and that might be actually useful because we might want to add some texture detail here. So I'm gonna double click on this on the faces here to select everything, and then I'm gonna go to my UV menu and do a cylindrical mapping, and that's not gonna map it properly. I want to do a cylinder down the length here, so I need to go to my channel box and rotate by Z, and then I can use the interactive handles to map it all around, and that one doesn't matter as much. Let's do rotate back to 0. Let's check the UV editor. Oh, come on. There we go. So it's not perfect, but it's actually gonna do that pretty well. If you look at the checkerboard, it's kind of a little bit squashed, so you can roll that around. Actually, having a seam on the very top is probably not a good idea. So, well, we've done it now. We could change the projection. Also, this end is gotten very bad, and that's yeah, a little bit hard to do. But I mean, at the same time, this is not going to be visible to the player, at least not too much. So we could just make sure it's black or something like that. But yeah, if I was doing this for real, I would definitely choose to do a proper UV unwrap on this. This one I'm just going to do as automatic and scale it down. And the texture's kind of getting in the way here. Okay, so I've got a better unwrap now. It's not perfect by any means, but at least they're kind of in separate shells that match the sizing a little bit better. And I have my base, so I can take these elements, these shells, and kind of just arrange them in a layout that makes best use of the space available. And that works. Okay, so now how do I take this image out? Because this is now updated the UV layout, so I need to both take this image out and use it in Photoshop, but I also need to re-export my my tank here. Since we've changed the UV layout, this needs to get updated in the project. So I'm going to select the tank base, go to Send to Unity, and choose Selection. And then I'm going to overwrite my tank. And let's go back to Unity and see what's updated. Okay, so that's a little bit different. Notice how these black parts shifted around. That is because we moved the UV layout around. So what's happening right now is the smiley face is getting mapped straight onto this, just with the eyes up here and then the smile down here. So that's why it's a little bit, random. But we want to use this layout as our reference guide for when we kind of create the texture. So I'm going to go in my UV sets up to, where is it? Image, and then go to UV snapshot. And then I can browse, and I'm just going to go to the desktop and type in, for the name, tank UVs. And this is a little bit high. I'm going to go down to 1024. And then for the image format here, I'm going to change it to PNG. And then do apply. So now if we go to the desktop, we have a tank UVs. We can double click this, and it's a little bit hard to see on here, but if you create a new layer and fill that with like white or black and drag that below, you can see, oh, actually that's a good point. You can only see the tank body. So that's a little bit tricky, but when you've only selected on a single object here, it is only going to export the UVs for that object, even though when we clicked on this, it was showing all of them. So a little bit misleading, but if you have multiple objects and they're all part of the same UV tile, you can shift select all of them and then do an overwrite on that image. And let's see if we reopen it, what happens. Okay, now we get those barrel and turret top. Okay, so now we have these guidelines. We can create a new layer, and let's say instead of just a simple color here, let's say we wanted to like put some sort of logo on here. Let me search for something quickly. So let's just search for I'm searching for like a medieval banner, just because it's kind of fun and interesting. Let's just choose this one. So I'm just gonna go into Google, picking a random image here, copy this image, and paste it in, and then I'm gonna scale this down and stick this right on the front of the tank right here. Now I don't actually know which is the front. It might be worth checking in Maya. I think this is the front. We could select a face. Yeah, okay, so the bottom of this is the front here. And that also tells me that I kind of want to avoid this top portion, these two. So I'm just going to stick it like right. It's going to be kind of small, but stick it right here. Okay, cool. So now what we can do is save this. I kind of recommend saving this whenever you're texturing in Photoshop like this. Save this as like a PSD file because you have all your layers. But then when you want to do an export, you can save it out as a PNG, and you can save it on the desktop. You can save it straight into your assets. So I'm going to navigate into my textures here and save it as tank base albedo and save that out. And now inside Unity, instead of this smiley face, let's select our mesh and go to the material and oops, wrong object. There we go, there's the tank base. We can drag and drop this texture on, and now we have a nice little logo. Now it's a little bit smushed because I think we made some adjustments to the actual scale of the tank object and didn't reproject our UVs, so not quite perfect, but this is kind of a good lesson because anytime you do something, there's this process of iteration and you put it in the engine, you see how it looks, make some adjustments or figure out what you want to change about it, and then go back. So when you have all three programs open and you are just changing things in one and then exporting those and checking it in the engine, that's kind of a good process to go through because it lets you quickly make adjustments and tune up your image or your assets. Okay, so let's make a couple more materials, and I want to show you how to use the metallic and normal map channels. These are a little more complex. The albedo just takes a simple image. The metallic and the normals take very specifically formatted images. And I have open here the Unity page for the standard shader. So if you search Unity standard shader, this is what you'll get. And if you're interested and want to learn more about how Unity renders stuff, I recommend you reading all of this because it goes into some good detail. The important thing is that when you're setting up the metallic properties and the smoothness properties, you have to use some very specifically formatted images. And I'm trying to find, yeah, so here in the material parameters, metallic mode parameter, what it requires is an image that uses different channels of the image to specify data about both the metallic and the smoothness. And the reason why they do this, the reason why instead of just having two separate channels here, two separate images, it's just for efficiency. If the graphics rendering only has to look up a single file and then you access the different channels of that file, that's half the amount of performance cost, at least in loading that texture and looking up the appropriate data. So it's for efficiency that they do this, but it makes it much harder to work with if you're kind of authoring your textures from scratch. So if you need to do this, the takeaway is that where is it in here? Okay, with a texture assigned to the image, both the metallic and smoothness sliders will disappear. Instead, the metallic levels for the material are controlled by values in the red channel, and smoothness controls the alpha channel, is controlled by the alpha channel. So in our example image with texture transparency turned on, we had white and black and transparent. So this is an image that has the kind of required elements for that metallic map. And just to review, black is controlling metallic, and typically you only ever want metallic to be on or off. That's how you achieve most materials in the real world. There aren't things in the real world that are 50% metallic. Something is either metallic or it's not metallic, like wood or paper or something like that. And so for your maps, you will typically have a black and white image to control metallic portions in white and non-metallic portions in black, and then you will have transparency to control the percentage of smoothness. So something that has 0 transparency is going to be very diffuse, whereas something that is fully opaque will be very smooth. So if we apply this to our tank, what we should see is some variation in both the metallic property and the smoothness. So you can see here that our instead of painting that black and white image on, we have now a very metallic main body, and then where the smile was, it is gone completely non-metallic. And it's a little bit hard to see the transparency. If we took this and opened it up and then erased a little bit more, let's erase with some like smooth fuzzy edges here. We save that back out and then go back to Unity. Now you can see spots that are diffuse and spots that are metallic. So our map is controlling both of those properties. Now smoothness is still here, and that's just kind of an override. So you can turn something all the way, the smoothness all the way off if you want, but it is being controlled by this. So for very simple objects, you can kind of set this yourself. Is something metallic? Is it made of metal or is it not? And how smooth is it? Sometimes you want kind of a bumpy feel to the smoothness, or parts that are more sort of worn down, and so a map is going to be what you need. But sometimes you can just do all you need to do with these sliders right here. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to tell you about is a normal map. And a normal map is a very different type of, visually very different to the other maps. And if you remember back from your texture type, there's a setting here for normal maps. So they even need to be imported in a different way. If you go to Google and you just search normal map example, and you click on images here, you're going to see lots of images that have this blue aesthetic to them. And this is what a normal map is. It uses two channels inside of this image to basically add detail. So this is kind of a nifty example right here. Let me open this up so I can show you what's going on. So this stone rock looks on the left like a pretty realistic piece of geometry, right? But if you look at it, the geometry is very low, kind of low topology. This normal map is adding all of this detail to the rock. And same with this guy right here. The right hand side has been normal mapped and you see all of this bumpy detail. The reason why you do this in a game is because if you were trying to create all of this detail with geometry, the poly count of your asset would go through the roof and you wouldn't be able to use very many of them, or you'd have to, limit the things you were doing in your game because your rendering budget would be used up. So a normal map is a way to add detail that kind of gets around this limitation. So let's grab one of these. Let's just take one. Sure, this 256 kind of, I don't even know what that is. It's kind of like a little bubbles or something like that. Let's take this and right click and save it on the desktop as bubbles_normal. And I guess I could have saved that right into our assets folder, but let me go ahead and import this desktop. Oh, where did it go? Downloads? Oh, I put it in downloads by mistake. Okay, dragging and dropping that in. Now it's figured out that it hasn't figured out what image type this is. It it's colored blue, and that's how it looks in the by default. But basically, when you drag and drop this onto a material and put it in the material spot, so let's try and drag it into the normal map spot on the tank. It's going to say, hey, this texture has not been marked as a normal map. Do you want to fix it? And that is just because this texture type did not get set. So we can do it here, clicking on the asset. We can do it inside the material. And here you go. So you can see now that the normal map on this thing, kind of low resolution, but it is working. Certainly from the game view up here, you can see that there's this added detail now to the surface. Now the reason why you would want to do this as a normal map instead of a kind of adding that detail into the albedo is because a normal map will respond to lighting. So as I move the light source around, you can see that the shadows on the actual normal map are changing. So it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see the shadows in the map are adjusting with the light source. So normal maps respond to lighting, which gives them a much more realistic behavior in the scene. Cool. Okay, so we've explored the texture workflow on the sort of basic, very rudimentary way to create textures and import them and then set them up on a material to achieve different effects. Now there's obviously this is not the most efficient way to go through this. Video games will require a very complex authoring of textures and management of those textures. And if you have to go through and hand create each of your textures, you're going to spend a lot of time. So that's how games were done in the olden days. Now we have tools and workflows to do that for us. And tools like Substance Designer or Substance Painter will actually output, you'll craft your textures from physically realistic materials, so leather or metals or wood, and there's lots of built-in options there. And when those programs, when you're done texturing in those programs, they will output specific files which have already been set up, ready for your use. So your standard shader, if you have that, Unity standard shader is the output, in Substance, you will get an albedo, you'll get a metallic that has the properties set up correctly, a normal map, you can export occlusion maps, lots of different options there, height maps as well. So so you never really need to kind of go this hands-on with texturing, at least not if you're if you know what you're doing. But it's important to know what's going on behind the scenes so you can quickly create stuff, or you can modify stuff that you've already created. Now there are the one type of 2D image kind of import that we didn't talk about were the sprites. And since this video is getting kind of long, what I'm going to do is save that for the video where we create the interface. But essentially it's the exact same process. You create an image inside of some authoring program and you import it, and instead of having it be a default file type, it's imported as a sprite, and now you can assign it to UI elements. Or if you're making a 2D game, you're going to use Sprite to do the majority of your in-game assets as well. So hopefully you've got a sort of grip on the 2D content pipeline here. Lots of tools exist to speed up this process, and there are lots of videos on how to use those tools available on YouTube or from the creators of the tools themselves. So in the next video, we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and live in Unity and use the lighting and the post-processing features in Unity to create a look that gives your game a little bit of, a dynamic and pleasing aesthetic.